The bullet that killed Elias Hurst came from a stranger's gun on a gray October morning in 1878, and it was a stranger who found him 3 days later, half buried in the mud along Two Feather Creek, in the Montana Territory some 40 miles north of Miles City. That stranger was Marshall Yates, a solitary rider who made his living hunting stray cattle for the big outfits and hiring his gun out to no one, though he carried one all the same. He had been following a broken fence line back toward the rocking H spread when his horse balked at the smell of death drifting up from the creek bank, and there he found Elias Hurst, face down in the current, his boots caught on a fallen cottonwood root, his hat long gone downstream. Marshall Yates was not a man given to sentiment. He had seen death plenty in his 31 years, first as a boy who watched his own father go down with fever, later as a young man who had ridden with the cavalry against the Sioux and seen things he did not care to speak of afterward. But something about the stillness of that creek, the way the dead man's hand seemed to reach for something just beyond his grasp, made Marshall dismount and remove his hat before he did anything else. He buried Elias Hurst himself, right there above the creek where the ground was soft enough to dig without a proper spade, using the small folding shovel he carried for grave purposes of his own. For a man who rode alone in that country learned quickly that burying the dead was sometimes a kindness only a stranger could offer. He said what words he remembered from his mother's Bible, though he could not recall if they were the right words for a man he had never known, and he marked the grave with a cross made of 2 branches bound with rawhide string. It was only when he went through the dead man's coat pockets, looking for some way to know who to notify, that he found the letter, water-stained but still legible, addressed to a woman named Pauline Hurst at a homestead near the forks of the Rosebud. Marshall Yates sat back on his heels in the cold mud and read the letter twice, though it was not addressed to him, and he felt some shame in reading it at all. It was a simple letter, the kind a husband writes to a wife when he is away buying cattle and misses her more than he lets himself say in the daylight. It spoke of a promise to return by the first frost, of a longing for her biscuits and her voice, and of a hope that the calf she had been worried over had come through the birthing well. There was no way around it. Someone had to tell her. Marshall rode 2 days to reach the Hurst homestead, leading Elias' horse behind him, a good bay gelding that had wandered back to the ranch on its own and been caught by a neighboring rancher who had no idea what had become of its owner. He rehearsed what he might say the whole way, and none of it sounded right to his own ears, not even the words he had heard preachers use for such occasions. When he finally came within sight of the small cabin with its sod roof and its neat rows of drying corn, he almost turned back twice. Pauline Hurst was hanging wash on a line strung between 2 fence posts when she saw the rider coming, and something in the way he sat his horse, slow and heavy, like a man carrying more than saddlebags, told her before he ever opened his mouth that the news he brought was the kind that changes a life forever. She was 26 years old that autumn, with dark hair she wore in a simple braid down her back and hands roughened by 4 years of frontier living, though her eyes still held the softness of a woman who had once dreamed of an easier life back in Ohio before love had brought her west. She set down the wet shirt she had been pinning and stood very still, watching the stranger approach, and when he stopped his horse a respectful distance from the cabin and removed his hat, she knew. "Ma'am," Marshall Yates said, and his voice cracked on the single word, surprising him. "Are you Mrs. Hurst, Mrs. Pauline Hurst?" "I am," she said, and her voice was steady even as her hands began to tremble at her sides. "My name is Marshall Yates. I found your husband along Two Feather Creek 3 days past." He paused, searching for gentler words and finding none. "I'm sorry to tell you he had passed on before I came upon him. There was nothing I could do for him but see that he was laid to rest proper." Pauline did not scream or weep in that first moment, as Marshall had half expected. She simply reached out one hand and gripped the edge of the wash line as though the earth itself had tilted beneath her, and she said, very quietly, "How?" Shot, Marshall said, for he would not lie to her, not about a thing like this. I could not say by whom. There were no other tracks I could follow with any certainty. The rain had done its work on the ground before I got there. Robbers, Pauline said, and it was not a question so much as a bitter conclusion she had already reached in her mind, for Elias had been carrying money from the sale of cattle when he left, money enough to tempt a desperate man on a lonely road. He was carrying near $200. That would explain it, Marshall said. There was no money on him when I found him. Pauline's knees gave out then, not all at once, but slowly, like a fence post rotted through at the base, and Marshall Yates was down off his horse and across the yard before she reached the ground, catching her beneath the arms and easing her down rather than letting her fall. He did not know this woman, had never laid eyes on her before that hour, and yet he found himself holding her as she wept against his dusty shirt, and something in his chest ached in a way he had not felt in a great many years. There were 2 children who came running from the barn at the sound of their mother's cries, a boy of 8 named Thomas and a girl of 5 named Ruth, and Marshall Yates found himself, within the space of an hour, digging a proper grave for Elias Hurst's memory, even though the body already lay far off along the creek, so that the family might have a place close to home to grieve. A small plot beneath a cottonwood tree at the edge of the property where Pauline said her husband had always liked to sit of an evening. He stayed 3 days at the Hurst homestead that October, though he told himself it was only decency that kept him, only the plain fact that a woman with 2 children and a fall harvest half in the ground could not be left entirely alone with her grief. He mended the fence Elias had been riding out to check when he was killed. He brought in the last of the corn. He split enough wood to see the family through the coming cold, more wood than any 3 days' work should have produced, though Pauline noticed and said nothing, only watched him from the cabin window with an expression she could not have named even to herself. On the 3rd evening, as the light went gold and long across the prairie grass, Pauline came out to where Marshall was splitting the last of the cottonwood logs and stood watching him for a long moment before she spoke. "You did not have to do all this, Mr. Yates," she said. "You buried him. You brought me the news. A lesser man would have ridden on and never looked back." Marshall set down the axe and wiped his brow with his sleeve. "A lesser man might have, ma'am. I could not see my way to it, knowing what was left behind." He glanced toward the children who were playing near the barn, the boy showing his sister some trick with a length of rope. A woman alone out here with young ones. "It did not sit right with me to simply ride away." "You did not know us," Pauline said. "You did not know him." "No," Marshall admitted. "But I have buried men before, ma'am, in my time, and I have learned that the dead do not much need our sorrow. It is the living who need tending." He paused, looking at his own hands, roughened by rope and rain and now fresh splinters from the axe handle. "I suppose I could not leave a job half finished." Pauline studied him in the fading light. This quiet, weathered man who had ridden into her life, bearing the worst news a woman could receive, and had then stayed to make himself useful in every way he could find, asking for nothing in return, not even a meal beyond what was offered freely. There was something in his manner, a steadiness, a gentleness beneath the roughness of frontier living, that reminded her faintly of Elias in the early days of their courtship, though she pushed the thought away as soon as it came, ashamed of herself for thinking of any man in that way so soon after burying her husband. "You will stay for supper," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I would be obliged, ma'am," Marshall said, and something passed between them in that moment, unspoken and unacknowledged, a small thread that would in time become a rope strong enough to bind 2 lives together, though neither of them could have said so on that cold October evening, with the grave still fresh beneath the cottonwood tree and the grief still raw as an open wound. Marshall Yates rode on the following morning, as he knew he must, for a man could not simply take up residence in a widow's home without inviting the kind of talk that would do her reputation no good in a country where gossip traveled faster than any horse. But before he left, he told Pauline that he would return before the snow came deep, to check on her and the children, to see that they had what they needed to see out the winter. And Pauline, standing in her doorway with Ruth's small hand in hers, found herself watching him ride away with a feeling she could not quite place, something that was not quite grief and not quite hope, but some strange, uncertain place between the two. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a hard one across the Montana Territory, with snows that came early and stayed late, and Pauline Hurst learned in those months just how much work it took for one woman to keep a homestead running with only 2 young children to help her. She milked the cow before dawn each morning, her breath frosting in the lantern light of the barn, and she chopped what wood Marshall had not already split, and she rationed the flour and salt pork carefully, for there would be no trip to town for supplies until the roads cleared in spring. Marshall Yates was true to his word. He came twice that winter, once in December with a wagon load of firewood he claimed he had cut too much of for his own needs and did not know what else to do with, and once in February, riding through a snowstorm that any sensible man would have waited out, to bring a sack of flour and a bolt of wool cloth he said had come cheap at the Mercantile in Miles City, though Pauline suspected the price had not been so cheap as he claimed. "You did not need to ride out in weather like this, Mr. Yates," Pauline said that February evening, ushering him inside where the children sat close to the stove, their cheeks pink with cold despite the fire. "You could have waited for a clear day." "Weather does not wait on convenience, ma'am," Marshall said, stamping the snow from his boots, "and I could not rightly say when a clear day might come this far into winter. Better to bring what was needed than to wait and find you short." Thomas, now 9 years old and fast growing into the kind of boy who idolized any man who could sit a horse and rope a steer, tugged at Marshall's coat sleeve. "Mr. Yates, will you show me that knot again? The one for the rope." "After I have warmed my hands, son," Marshall said, and there was a warmth in his voice when he spoke to the boy that made Pauline's chest tight with a feeling she still refused to name. They sat together that evening around the small table, sharing a supper of salt pork and beans and the last of the previous autumn's dried apples, and the conversation flowed easier than Pauline would have expected, given how little these two people truly knew of each other. Marshall spoke, haltingly at first and then more freely, of his years with the cavalry, of the loneliness of a rider's life, of a mother back in Missouri who had died when he was scarcely older than Thomas was now. Pauline spoke of Ohio, of the farm she had grown up on, of meeting Elias at a church social, and following him west on nothing but love and the promise of good land. "Do you regret it?" Marshall asked her once the children had been put to bed and the two of them sat by the dying fire, speaking low so as not to wake the little ones. "Coming west, I mean, with all that has happened." Pauline considered the question for a long moment, watching the embers shift and settle. "No," she said finally, "I do not regret loving Elias or coming west with him. I regret only that our time together was cut so short. But I have this land now and these children, and I will not let his death be for nothing. I mean to keep this place going, Mr. Yates, whatever it takes." "I do not doubt you will," Marshall said, and there was such quiet admiration in his voice that Pauline felt her cheeks warm despite the cold night air seeping through the cabin walls. Spring came slowly to the Montana Territory that year, but when it came with a rush of green across the prairie and the sound of meltwater rushing in every creek and gully. Marshall Yates found himself riding out to the Hurst homestead more often than his cattle work strictly required, and if the other ranchers who employed him noticed his frequent absences, they said nothing, for Marshall had always been a man who kept his own counsel and did his work well when he was present. It was in April, with the wildflowers just beginning to dot the hillsides in purple and gold, that Marshall arrived to find Pauline struggling with a stubborn plow horse that had thrown a shoe and gone lame in one hoof, leaving her with no way to break the new ground she had hoped to plant that season. "Let me look at him," Marshall said, dismounting and moving to the horse's side with the calm confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime around animals. He lifted the injured hoof, examined it with careful fingers, and pronounced, "It is not so bad as it looks. A few days' rest and he will be sound again. But you cannot wait on the planting, not if you mean to have a crop worth harvesting come fall." "I have no other horse to pull the plow," Pauline said, frustration plain in her voice. "And no money to buy one, not until I can sell what stock I have to spare, which I cannot do until the roads to town are drier." Marshall was quiet a moment, considering. "I have a horse," he said. "A good, strong gelding, well used to plow work from my days breaking horses for the army remount station. I could bring him out, and we could get your fields turned in a few days' time, you and I working together." "I could not ask that of you," Pauline said, though the relief in her eyes betrayed how much she wanted to accept the offer. "You are not asking," Marshall said simply. "I am offering. There is a difference, ma'am, and I would ask you not to be too proud to see it." Pauline laughed then, a real laugh, the first Marshall had heard from her since he had known her, and the sound of it seemed to surprise her as much as it pleased him. "You are a stubborn man, Mr. Yates." "So I have been told," Marshall said, a small smile touching his own weathered face. "Mostly by men whose cattle I have found when they said it could not be done." They worked together for 4 days that April, turning the black earth beneath a sky full of high white clouds, Marshall guiding the plow while Pauline walked alongside with the seed bag, and Thomas trailing behind them both, dropping seeds into the furrows with the careful concentration of a boy who had been told this was important work that mattered to his family's survival. Ruth played nearby with a rag doll her mother had sewn for her the previous Christmas, singing little songs to herself in the warm spring sun. It was during those long days of shared labor that Pauline found herself watching Marshall Yates with something more than simple gratitude. She watched the easy way he handled the plow horse, speaking to the animal in a low, soothing voice when it grew tired or balky. She watched the patience he showed with Thomas, teaching the boy to coil a rope properly, to check a horse's hooves for stones, to read the weather in the shape of the clouds. She watched, too, the way he sometimes caught her eye across the field and looked away quickly, as though embarrassed to be caught looking at all. On the evening of the 4th day, with the last field turned and seeded, they sat together on the porch step watching the sun go down in a blaze of orange and pink across the western hills, the children already asleep inside after a supper of fresh trout Marshall had caught that morning in the creek. "I could not have managed this season without you, Marshall," Pauline said, using his given name for the first time, and the sound of it in her voice made something shift in his chest. "I do not know how to thank you properly." "You need not thank me," Marshall said, though he found himself unable to look away from her in the fading light, from the way the sunset caught the loose strands of hair that had escaped her braid during the day's work. "I have found more satisfaction in this week's labor than in a month of chasing another man's cattle." "Is that so?" Pauline said, and there was something almost teasing in her tone, a lightness that had been absent from her voice for many long months. "It is," Marshall said, and then, because the moment seemed to call for honesty, he added, "I have found myself thinking of this place and of you and the children more than I have any right to, Pauline. I do not say this to trouble you or to suggest anything improper, given how short a time has passed since Elia's. I only wished you to know it." Pauline was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. "It has been 6 months," she said finally. "Some might say that is too short a time for a widow to be entertaining such thoughts from any man. But I confess, Marshall, I have found myself thinking of you as well, more often than I care to admit even to myself. There is something in the way you carry yourself, the way you have cared for this family without asking anything for it, that has settled into my heart in a manner I did not expect nor entirely welcome, given the circumstances. I would never wish to dishonor Elia's memory," Marshall said carefully, "nor to rush you into anything your heart is not ready for." "I know that," Pauline said. "It is part of why I have allowed myself to feel what I feel. A lesser man would have pressed his advantage long before now, given how much I have come to depend on your help these past months. You have not done so, and I am grateful for it, even as I find myself wishing on evenings like this one that you might." Marshall turned to look at her then, and in the last of the twilight, he saw something in her eyes that gave him courage he had not felt since his cavalry days, when charging into uncertain danger had seemed a simpler thing than sitting beside a woman he was coming to love and finding the words to say so. "Pauline," he said, and her name felt like a prayer on his lips. "I would not wish to speak too soon, nor to press you toward anything before you are ready, but I will say this. I have buried one good man in my time, a man I never knew but came to respect through the family he left behind. I would count it the greatest honor of my life if you would someday allow me the chance to build something new alongside you, when the time is right, when your heart has healed enough to make room for such a thing." Pauline reached out and took his hand then, her fingers rough from work but warm against his own callous palm. "The time may be sooner than either of us expected, Marshall Yates," she said softly. "Grief does not follow a calendar, and I have found these past months that my heart has room enough for both my memory of Elia's and whatever new thing might be growing here between us. I would not call it too soon if you were to ask me properly one day, when you felt the moment was right." They did not kiss that evening, for both of them understood there was still a proper way to go about such things in a country where reputation mattered as much as love. But they sat together until the stars came out fully overhead, hands clasped between them, and something had shifted between them that neither would deny again. The summer of 1879 passed in a blur of hard work and slow, careful courtship. Marshall came to the homestead as often as his cattle work allowed, and when he could not come himself, he sent word by whatever rider happened to be passing through. Small notes that made Pauline smile despite herself as she read them by lamplight after the children had gone to sleep. The town of Miles City, small as it was, began to take notice of the pattern, and though there was some talk among the more judgmental of the townsfolk about a widow entertaining a suitor so soon after her husband's death, there was more understanding than condemnation, for the frontier was a hard place, and most folks understood the practical necessity of a woman finding help where she could, and the genuine affection that grew from shared hardship. It was Reverend Whitfield, the circuit preacher who came through the territory once a month to hold services in whatever barn or schoolhouse could accommodate a congregation, who first spoke openly to Pauline about the matter, catching her after a Sunday service in July. "Mrs. Hurst," the Reverend said, his weathered face kind beneath his wide-brimmed hat, "I have heard some talk in town about you and Mr. Yates. I would not wish to pry into matters that are not mine to judge, but I would ask, as a man of God who has known grief himself, whether your heart has found some peace in this new attachment, or whether it moves too quickly for comfort." Pauline considered the question seriously, for she respected Reverend Whitfield and knew he asked out of genuine concern rather than mere gossip. "Reverend," she said, "I loved Elias Hurst with all my heart, and I will grieve him the rest of my days in some quiet corner of my soul. But I have 2 children who need a father's guidance, and a homestead that requires more strength than one woman alone can provide, and I have found in Marshall Yates a man of genuine goodness, who has never once pressed me toward anything I was not ready to give. I do not believe the Lord intends for us to grieve alone forever, when He sends someone worthy into our path." The Reverend nodded slowly, satisfied by her answer. "Then I will say only this, Mrs. Hurst. I have known Marshall Yates some years now, since he first came into this territory, and I have never known him to be anything but an honest man, slow to anger and quick to help those in need. If your heart has found comfort in his company, I would not counsel you to deny it out of fear of what others might say. Grief has its own timeline, and love, when it is genuine, does not wait for society's convenient calendar." Comforted by the Reverend's words, Pauline found herself less troubled by the whispers that occasionally reached her ears in town, and more focused on the genuine happiness that had begun to bloom in her heart, however cautiously, as the summer months passed. It was in August, during the height of the haying season, that trouble arrived in a form neither Pauline nor Marshall had anticipated. A man named Silas Crabtree, who ran a small operation some miles to the east of the Hurst homestead, appeared at Pauline's door on a hot afternoon, while Marshall was away helping with a roundup at the Rocking H, claiming that Elias Hurst had owed him a debt of $150 from a business arrangement made shortly before his death, a debt he now expected Pauline to honor. "I have no knowledge of any such debt, Mr. Crabtree," Pauline said, standing firm in her doorway though her heart raced with worry, for $150 was a sum she simply did not have, not after the hard winter and the cost of seed for spring planting. "Elias never mentioned any dealings with you." "That does not make it any less true, ma'am," Crabtree said, an oily smile on his thin face that did nothing to ease Pauline's suspicion of the man. "I have a paper here, signed by your late husband, attesting to the debt." He produced a folded document, and Pauline, examining it carefully, saw a signature that did indeed resemble Elias' hand, though something about the whole arrangement felt wrong to her, some instinct she could not quite name. "I will need time to consider this matter," Pauline said carefully. "I cannot simply hand over such a sum without understanding the full circumstances of this debt." "I would not wait too long, Mrs. Hurst," Crabtree said, his tone taking on a harder edge beneath the false politeness. "A woman alone with children to feed cannot afford to ignore her late husband's obligations. I would hate to see this matter go before the county court, where such things tend to become considerably more expensive to resolve." After Crabtree rode away, Pauline sat at her kitchen table for a long while, the false paper spread before her, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. When Marshall arrived 2 days later, she showed him the document immediately, her worry plain on her face. Marshall examined the paper carefully, holding it up to the lamplight, turning it this way and that. "Pauline," he said finally, "I do not believe this signature is genuine. Look here at the way the letters slant. I have seen enough of Elias' hand from letters you have shown me to know this is not quite right. The pressure is wrong, too even, like a man copying rather than writing naturally." "Then what do we do?" Pauline asked, relief and renewed worry warring in her voice. "If we accuse Crabtree of forgery and cannot prove it, he may make things far worse for us." "We will need proof," Marshall said, his expression turning thoughtful and serious in a way Pauline had not often seen from him. "I know a man in Miles City, works at the land office, has some experience with such documents from his years as a bank clerk back east. We will show him this paper, and any other examples of Elias' true signature you might have kept, and let him render his judgment. If Crabtree has indeed forged this debt, we will have grounds to bring the matter before the sheriff." They rode to Miles City together the following week, leaving the children in the care of a neighboring family, and the clerk at the land office, a careful, spectacled man named Otis Reardon, confirmed after careful examination that the signature on Crabtree's paper did not match several genuine examples of Elias Hurst's handwriting that Pauline had preserved among her late husband's letters. "This is forgery, plain and clear," Reardon pronounced. "I would stake my professional reputation on it." The man who wrote this signature was attempting to imitate another's hand, but he did not account for the natural variations that occur even within a single man's true signature. Armed with this judgment, Marshall and Pauline went together to see Sheriff Dawes, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache who had kept order in the territory for the better part of a decade and had little patience for con men who preyed on vulnerable widows. "Silas Crabtree," Sheriff Dawes said, shaking his head when he heard the story. "I have had my suspicions about that man for some time now. There was a similar complaint filed against him last year, concerning a rancher's widow near Forsyth, though the matter was never fully resolved before the family moved on. I will ride out and have a conversation with Mr. Crabtree myself, and I expect this matter of the false debt will be dropped rather quickly once he understands the law has taken an interest." True to the sheriff's prediction, Silas Crabtree did not trouble Pauline again after Sheriff Dawes paid him a visit, and word later reached the Hurst homestead that the man had packed up his small operation and moved on to Wyoming territory rather than face the consequences of his attempted fraud. Pauline felt a great weight lift from her shoulders at the news, and she found herself, in the quiet aftermath of the ordeal, more certain than ever of her feelings for the man who had stood beside her through the entire trial. "You did not have to involve yourself in this matter the way you did," Pauline told Marshall one evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "You could have simply advised me and let me handle it on my own." "I could have," Marshall agreed. "But I did not want to, Pauline. When I see something threatening you or your children, something in me will not allow me to stand aside and merely offer advice. I want to be beside you, fighting whatever battles come, not simply watching from a comfortable distance." "That sounds very much like a declaration, Marshall Yates," Pauline said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth despite the seriousness that had colored the previous weeks. "Perhaps it is," Marshall said, and this time he did not hesitate. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, and when she did not pull away, he leaned closer and kissed her softly, tentatively, as though asking permission even as he claimed it, and Pauline kissed him back with a certainty that surprised them both. "I have loved you for some months now," Marshall said, when they finally drew apart, his voice rough with emotion. "I did not wish to speak of it before, not while there was still so much uncertainty in your life, so much grief to work through. But I cannot pretend any longer that my feelings are anything less than love, Pauline Hurst, deep and abiding love, the kind I did not expect to find again in this life." "I love you as well, Marshall," Pauline said, tears standing in her eyes though her smile was radiant in the fading light. "I have fought against admitting it, telling myself it was too soon, that Elias deserved a longer mourning from me. But I have come to understand that loving you does not diminish what I felt for him. It simply means my heart has found room for a new chapter, one I did not expect but one I welcome with all that I am." They were married in September of 1879, a full year after Elias Hurst's death, in a simple ceremony held in the small church in Miles City, with Reverend Whitfield presiding over vows that both Pauline and Marshall spoke with clear voices and steady hearts. Thomas, now 10 years old, stood proudly beside Marshall as a kind of young groomsman, having come to love the man who had taught him so much over the past year. And Ruth, now 6, scattered wildflower petals down the makeshift aisle with the seriousness of a girl who understood, in her own small way, that something important and joyful was happening in her family's life. The wedding was attended by most of the small community that had come to know and respect both Pauline and Marshall over the preceding months, including Sheriff Dawes, who offered his hearty congratulations, and Otis Reardon from the land office, who had become something of a friend to the family after his help with the Crabtree matter. Even some of the townsfolk who had initially whispered about the propriety of the courtship had come around to genuine happiness for the couple, understanding by then the true character of both parties involved and the honest love that had grown between them, despite its unusual beginning. "It is not every woman who finds her second husband in the man who buried her first," Reverend Whitfield said in his brief remarks before the ceremony. "But I have come to believe that the Lord's ways of bringing people together are sometimes stranger and more wonderful than we might expect." Marshall Yates came into Pauline Hurst's life bearing the worst news a woman can receive, and yet he stayed, through grief and hardship and danger, to become the very foundation of a new happiness neither of them could have foreseen on that terrible autumn day. If that is not evidence of God's hand at work, I do not know what would be. The years that followed were not without their hardships, for frontier life in the Montana Territory offered no shortage of challenges even to the most devoted of couples. There were harsh winters that tested their resources and their resolve, and lean years when the cattle prices dropped and money grew tight, and the ever-present dangers of frontier life, from illness to accident to the occasional threat of conflict with those who resented the steady encroachment of settlers onto lands that had once belonged solely to the tribes who had lived there for generations. A tension that Marshall, having served in the cavalry, understood better than most and always spoke of, with a measure of regret for the injustices done to those original inhabitants of the land, injustices he had witnessed firsthand and could never fully reconcile within his own conscience, though he tried always to deal fairly and respectfully with the Crow and Cheyenne families, who occasionally passed through their region, trading goods and sharing information about weather and water sources in a manner that spoke to a grudging mutual respect, forged through shared hardship on a difficult land. But through all these challenges, the bond between Pauline and Marshall only grew stronger, tempered like good steel through fire and cold water, until it became something unshakable, a partnership built not merely on romantic affection but on genuine respect and shared purpose. In the spring of 1880, Pauline gave birth to their first child together, a healthy boy they named William, after Marshall's father, and Marshall wept openly when he first held the infant in his arms, overcome with a joy he had not expected to feel again in his life after so many years of solitary wandering. "I never thought I would have a family of my own," Marshall admitted to Pauline that evening, as she rested in their bed with the new baby sleeping peacefully beside her. "I had made my peace with a solitary life, riding from job to job, with no one to answer to but myself, and now look at what the Lord has given me. A wife I love beyond measure, 2 children who have become as dear to me as if they were my own blood, and now this little one born of our own love. You have always been Thomas and Ruth's father in every way that matters," Pauline said softly, reaching out to touch his weathered cheek. "Blood is not the only thing that makes a family, Marshall. It is the showing up, day after day, the choosing to stay and to care and to build something together. You have done that from the very first day I met you, standing in my yard with your hat in your hands, delivering news that broke my heart even as your presence, somehow, began to mend it." 2 years later, in 1882, a daughter followed whom they named Sarah, after Pauline's own mother back in Ohio, and the small homestead that had once seemed so precarious under Pauline's solitary management had grown, under their combined efforts, into a thriving operation, with a proper barn built to replace the old sod structure, additional acreage brought under cultivation, and a small herd of cattle that Marshall had built up through careful breeding and shrewd trading, drawing on skills learned during his years of cattle work before he had ever met the widow who would become his wife. Thomas, growing into a fine young man under Marshall's steady guidance, had developed into a skilled horseman and cattleman in his own right, and by the time he reached 18 years of age in 1887, he had already begun to take on significant responsibility for managing the ranch's growing herd, a source of tremendous pride for both his mother and his stepfather, who had never once, in all the years since their marriage, treated the boy as anything less than his own son. Ruth, too, grew into a capable young woman, skilled in the domestic arts her mother had taught her, but possessed also of a fierce independence that Marshall had encouraged from her earliest years, teaching her to ride and shoot with the same careful patience he had shown Thomas, believing firmly that a woman on the frontier needed to be capable of defending herself and her family, whatever society's conventions might suggest about proper feminine behavior. It was in 1889, with Montana having just achieved statehood that November, that the Yates family faced perhaps their greatest challenge since the early days of Pauline's widowhood, when a severe drought struck the region, threatening to destroy the herd that Marshall had spent a decade building, and to bankrupt the very homestead that had been Pauline's sole inheritance from Elias Hurst all those years before. The creek that had once run full and steady through their property, the same creek where Marshall had first found Elias Hurst's body 11 years earlier, dwindled to a mere trickle by midsummer, and the grass that should have fed their cattle through the growing season withered brown and brittle under a relentless sun that seemed to offer no mercy. "We cannot let the herd simply starve," Marshall said one evening, his weathered face lined with worry as he studied maps of the surrounding territory by lamplight, searching for any water source that might still hold enough to sustain their animals. "If we lose this year's cattle, we lose everything we have built. I have heard there is still water to be found up in the higher country, near the mountains, where the snowmelt lingers longer into summer even in dry years like this one. That is a hard drive for cattle already weakened by poor grazing," Pauline said, worry plain in her own voice as she considered the risks of such an undertaking. "And it would mean leaving the homestead unguarded for weeks, perhaps longer." "I know the risks," Marshall said, "but I do not see another choice before us. Thomas is old enough now to help me drive the herd, and between the two of us, along with a couple of hands we might hire from town, we should be able to manage it. You and Ruth and the younger children could manage the homestead in our absence, particularly if we ask the Fairweathers next door to keep a watchful eye on things." The plan, though risky, proved to be their salvation. Marshall and Thomas, along with 2 hired hands from Miles City, drove the weakened herd nearly 60 miles into the foothills of the mountains, where they found grass still green enough to sustain the cattle and water still flowing cool and clear from the high snowfields that had not entirely melted away even in that terrible dry summer. They remained in the high country for nearly 2 months through the worst of the drought, while Pauline managed the homestead with a competence born of long practice, assisted by Ruth, now 17, and every bit as capable as her mother had been at that age. When Marshall and Thomas finally returned in September, driving a herd that had not merely survived, but had actually thrived on the rich mountain grass, gaining weight and condition that would fetch a good price come the autumn cattle sales, Pauline wept with relief at the sight of them coming down from the hills, dust-covered and weary but triumphant. "I was so afraid," Pauline admitted that evening, holding Marshall close after the children had gone to bed, exhausted from the excitement of their father's return. "Every day you were gone, I imagined all the things that might have gone wrong, all the ways I might lose you the way I lost Elias." "I understand that fear," Marshall said gently, stroking her hair as they sat together by the fire. "I have carried a similar fear myself, all these years, wondering if some accident or illness might take me from you, and the children the way violence took Elias from you. But I have come to believe, Pauline, that we cannot let fear of loss prevent us from living fully, from taking the risks necessary to protect what we love. Elias would have driven that herd himself, had he lived to face such a drought. I simply did what any husband and father would do in my position." "You are not simply any husband," Pauline said softly. "You are the husband the Lord saw fit to send me, after taking my first one from this world in such a cruel and sudden fashion." "I do not believe that was mere chance, Marshall. I believe you were meant to find Elias that day, meant to bring me that terrible news, so that you might also bring me, in time, this life we have built together, this family, this love that has only grown stronger through every trial we have faced." The drought broke that autumn with heavy rains that replenished the creek and restored the grass to its former abundance, and the Yates family entered the 1890s with their homestead more prosperous than it had ever been, a testament to the years of hard work and mutual devotion that had transformed a widow's precarious inheritance into a thriving family legacy. Thomas married in 1891, taking as his wife a young woman named Emily Fairweather from the neighboring ranch, and the 2 young people settled on a portion of land that Marshall and Pauline gifted them as a wedding present, close enough to the main homestead that the families remained intimately connected even as Thomas began to build his own independent life. Marshall watched the young man he had helped raise stand at his own wedding altar with a pride that rivaled anything he might have felt for a son of his own blood. And indeed, in every way that mattered, Thomas had long since become exactly that. Ruth, too, found love in those years, marrying a young schoolteacher named Charles Bennett who had come west from Boston to take up a position at the new schoolhouse that had been built in the growing town that had sprung up not far from the Yates homestead. A town that had, fittingly enough, been named Hurstville by the early settlers in recognition of Elias Hurst's status as one of the original claimants to the valley's rich farmland. A fact that never failed to bring a bittersweet smile to Pauline's face whenever she considered how her first husband's memory continued to shape the community even decades after his death. William and Sarah, the children born of Pauline and Marshall's union, grew up knowing the story of how their parents had come together. For Pauline had never sought to hide the circumstances of Elias Hurst's death or the manner in which Marshall had entered their lives, believing firmly that honesty about the past, however painful, was preferable to secrecy that might fester into shame or confusion as the children grew older and inevitably heard whispered versions of the story from others in the small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Your father Elias was a good man," Pauline told William and Sarah when they were old enough to understand such things, sitting them down together on a quiet Sunday afternoon when they were perhaps 10 and 8 years old respectively. "He loved this land, and he loved Thomas and Ruth's mother, which is to say, he loved me very much in the brief years we had together. His death was a terrible tragedy, but from that tragedy came the man who would become your father, Marshall Yates, who found Elias and gave him a proper burial when a lesser man might have ridden on without a second thought. That act of kindness, that simple human decency, was the beginning of everything good that has come into our family's life since that terrible day. Were you sad, Mama, when Papa Marshall came to tell you the bad news?" Sarah asked, her young face serious with the gravity of the question. "I was more sad than I had ever been in my life up to that point," Pauline said honestly. "But I have come to believe that sadness and love are not opposites, my dear. Sometimes the deepest sadness opens a door to a new kind of love we could never have anticipated. Your father Marshall brought me terrible news that day, but he also brought me, without either of us knowing it at the time, the beginning of a new life, one filled with more happiness than I could have imagined possible in the depths of my grief." Marshall, listening from the doorway of the room where this conversation took place, felt his heart swell with emotion at his wife's words, and he thought, as he often did in quiet moments, of that cold October day so many years before, when he had knelt beside a creek and buried a stranger, never imagining that the act would lead him to the greatest love and happiness of his own life. By 1895, the Yates Ranch had become one of the most respected operations in the county, known for the quality of its cattle and the fairness with which Marshall and Pauline dealt with everyone from hired hands to neighboring ranchers to the merchants in town. Marshall had, over the years, also taken on a role as something of an informal mediator in local disputes, his reputation for honesty and fairness making him a natural choice when neighbors found themselves in disagreement over property lines or water rights or other matters that required careful, even-handed judgment. It was in the summer of that year that the family faced one final significant challenge, when a fire, sparked by a dry lightning strike during a summer storm, threatened to consume a significant portion of their grazing land and came dangerously close to the barn and outbuildings that housed both their equipment and several valuable breeding animals. The entire family, along with hired hands and neighbors who arrived to help fight the blaze, worked through a terrifying night, beating back flames with wet sacks and shovels of dirt, digging fire breaks with desperate speed, and hauling water from the creek in every available container to douse the flames threatening their home and livelihood. Marshall, now nearly 50 years old but still strong and capable from decades of physical labor, worked alongside Thomas and the hired hands at the front lines of the firefighting effort, while Pauline organized the women and older children in hauling water and tending to the exhausted workers who needed rest and refreshment between bouts of fighting the flames. By dawn, exhausted but victorious, the assembled group had succeeded in containing the fire before it could reach the barn or the house, though a significant portion of their best grazing land had been scorched black in the process. Marshall, covered in soot and ash, his hands blistered from hours of physical labor, found Pauline standing at the edge of the burned area, surveying the damage with a weary but determined expression. "We will recover from this," Marshall said, coming to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist despite his exhaustion. "The grass will grow back. We have enough hay stored to see the herd through until it does. This is not the worst thing we have faced together, Pauline, not by a long measure." "I know we will recover," Pauline said, leaning into his embrace. "I was not despairing over the loss, Marshall. I was simply thinking, as I often do in moments like this, of how far we have come together, from that terrible day when you first rode into this yard bearing news that broke my world apart, to this morning, standing here as husband and wife of 16 years, having built something together that neither fire nor drought nor any other hardship this hard land can throw at us seems able to fully destroy." 16 years, Marshall repeated softly, wonder in his voice. "It hardly seems possible. I remember that first day so clearly, riding up to your homestead, dreading the words I had to say, not knowing that I was about to meet the woman who would become the great love of my life." "Did you know, even then?" Pauline asked, curious despite having asked him similar questions many times over the years. "That first day, did some part of you sense what was to come between us?" Marshall considered the question seriously, as he always did when Pauline asked him to reflect on those early days of their acquaintance. "I do not know that I recognized it as love, not that first day. But I remember feeling something I had not felt in a great many years of solitary living, a sense that this place, this family, mattered to me in a way that went beyond simple decency or duty. I found myself wanting to return, wanting to help, wanting to know more about the woman whose grief had touched me so deeply despite having never met her husband in life. I suppose that was the beginning of love, even if I did not have the words for it at the time. "I am glad you came back," Pauline said simply, resting her head against his shoulder as the sun rose fully over the blackened but not destroyed landscape of their ranch. "I am glad, every single day, that the man who buried my first husband became the man who would spend the rest of his life loving me and our children, building this home with me, facing every hardship this land could offer alongside me rather than leaving me to face it alone." The grazing land did indeed recover, as Marshall had promised, and by the following spring, new grass had begun to push up through the ash, green and vigorous, a fitting symbol for a family that had learned, through years of shared hardship and joy, that love and life had a remarkable capacity for renewal, even after the most devastating losses. In 1898, William, now 18 years old and having grown into a young man who bore a striking resemblance to his father Marshall, though he had inherited his mother's dark hair and warm brown eyes, made the decision to attend an agricultural college in Bozeman, hoping to bring new scientific methods of ranching and farming back to the family operation. Marshall and Pauline saw him off at the train station in Miles City with equal parts pride, and the particular ache that comes from watching a beloved child begin to make his own way in the world. "You have raised a fine son," Pauline said to Marshall as they watched the train pull away from the station, carrying William toward his future. All of them really. Thomas with his own family and ranch now, Ruth teaching alongside her husband and raising 3 beautiful children of her own, William off to further his education, and Sarah, still at home but already showing such promise in her studies with Reverend Whitfield's successor at the church school. "We have raised them together," Marshall corrected gently, taking her hand as they walked back toward their wagon. "I could not have asked for a better partner in raising this family, Pauline. Every good thing that has come from our children, I attribute in large measure to your wisdom and love, and to the example you set for them every single day of their lives. Sarah, following in her mother's footsteps in many ways, showed a particular aptitude for the healing arts, and in 1900, at the age of 18, she began training as a nurse under the guidance of the doctor who had established a practice in Hurstville some years earlier, hoping to eventually establish her own practice serving the ranching families scattered throughout the surrounding countryside. Families who often had no easy access to medical care when illness or injury struck. It was during this period, as the century turned, and the wild frontier days of Marshall and Pauline's youth began to give way to a more settled, more modern West, that Marshall found himself reflecting often on the strange and wonderful path that had brought him to this point in his life. The wild territory he had first ridden into as a young cavalry veteran, seeking solitude and purpose in equal measure, had become a settled land of farms and ranches and towns, connected now by railroad lines that had not existed when he first found Elias Hurst's body along that lonely creek. "Do you ever think about him?" Pauline asked Marshall one evening in 1901, as they sat together on the porch of the house that had grown considerably from the simple cabin she had shared with Elias, now expanded with additional rooms to accommodate their larger family and their growing prosperity. "Elias, I mean. Do you ever wonder what he would think, seeing what has become of this place, this family?" Marshall considered the question with the seriousness he always brought to matters concerning his wife's first husband, a man he had never known in life but who had, in his own way, shaped the entire course of Marshall's existence through the simple, terrible fact of his death. "I think of him sometimes," Marshall admitted, "particularly when I look at Thomas, who has grown into such a fine man, or when I see Ruth's gentle strength in dealing with her own children. I like to think Elias would be proud of what his children have become, and grateful, perhaps, that fate sent someone to care for his family when he himself could no longer do so." "I believe he would be," Pauline said softly. "I have made my peace long ago with the sorrow of his death, and I have come to see, over these many years, that his loss, terrible as it was, opened a door to a happiness I could never have anticipated. I do not believe love diminishes by being shared across a lifetime, Marshall. I loved Elias with the whole heart of a young woman just beginning her life's journey. I love you with the deeper, more complex heart of a woman who has faced hardship and joy in equal measure and found, in you, a partner equal to every challenge we have faced together." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over land that had witnessed both tragedy and triumph in equal measure over the more than 20 years of their marriage, a marriage that had begun in the unlikeliest of circumstances, but had grown, through years of shared labor and mutual devotion, into something as solid and enduring as the mountains that rose blue and distant on the western horizon. In the spring of 1903, the entire extended family gathered at the original homestead to celebrate what would have been Pauline's 50th birthday, a joyous occasion that brought together Thomas and Emily with their 4 children, Ruth and Charles with their 3, William, now returned from his agricultural studies, and successfully implementing new ranching techniques that had increased the family's cattle yields significantly, and Sarah, now working as a respected nurse in Hurstville and being courted by a young doctor who had recently arrived to help expand the town's medical services. Marshall stood on the porch that afternoon, watching his grandchildren play in the yard where he had first buried a makeshift memorial cross for Elias Hurst all those years before, listening to the laughter and chatter of a family that had grown from tragedy into something rich and full and enduring, and he felt a gratitude so profound it nearly brought him to tears. "You are looking sentimental again," Pauline teased gently, coming to stand beside him, her dark hair now streaked with gray but her eyes still holding the same warmth and intelligence that had captured his heart on that terrible October day so many years before. "I cannot help it," Marshall said, wrapping his arm around her waist as they had done countless times over the years. "Look at what we have built here, Pauline. Look at this family, these children and grandchildren, this ranch that has thrived despite every hardship the frontier could throw at us. I never imagined, riding into this yard as a lonely stranger bearing terrible news, that I would find here the greatest happiness of my entire life. Nor did I imagine," Pauline said, "that the man who buried my first husband would become the very foundation upon which I would build the rest of my life, a life so much richer and fuller than I could have dreamed possible in those dark days of my first widowhood." She paused, watching their grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers that still bloomed abundantly each spring across the property. "We have been fortunate, Marshall, in ways that go beyond mere luck. We chose to trust each other, to build something together despite the unusual and difficult circumstances of our first meeting. That choice has been rewarded 1,000 times over in the years since." As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, the family gathered for a large meal set out on tables arranged in the yard, and Reverend Whitfield's successor, a younger man named Reverend Collins, who had taken over the ministry duties some years earlier when the elderly Whitfield had finally retired to live with his daughter in Billings, offered a blessing over the assembled family that spoke movingly of the strange and wonderful ways that grace could work through even the most tragic of circumstances to bring forth abundant life and love. Marshall Yates lived to see his 80th birthday, dying peacefully in 1927 in the same bed where he and Pauline had slept together for nearly 50 years, surrounded by his wife and children and grandchildren, having lived to witness the birth of several great-grandchildren as well, a testament to the enduring legacy of love that had begun in such unlikely and sorrowful circumstances so many decades before. Pauline followed him just 3 years later, in 1930, having spent her final years telling and retelling the story of how her second husband had been the man who buried her first, a story that had become something of a local legend in Hurstville, passed down through generations of the family as a testament to the redemptive power of love, found even in the darkest circumstances of grief and loss. The town of Hurstville itself grew and prospered over the decades that followed, eventually incorporating as a proper municipality with its own bank, several churches, and a growing population that included many descendants of the original Yates and Hurst families, all of whom knew, in some form or another, the romantic legend of how their ancestors had found love in the aftermath of tragedy on the wild Montana frontier. The small cottonwood tree under which Marshall had first helped Pauline create a memorial for Elias Hurst grew, over the decades, into a massive, sprawling tree that became something of a local landmark, and generations of Yates family members would gather beneath its shade for family reunions and celebrations, always remembering, in some quiet corner of their consciousness, the tragic beginning that had ultimately given rise to so much happiness and abundance. Thomas Hurst, who took his stepfather's guidance to heart throughout his life, eventually became one of the most respected ranchers in the entire region, and he named his own eldest son Marshall, in honor of the man who had raised him with such love and dedication, despite having no blood connection to him whatsoever, a fitting tribute to a relationship built entirely on choice and commitment rather than mere biological obligation. Ruth Hurst Bennett continued teaching alongside her husband for many years, eventually helping to establish a proper high school in Hurstville that served ranching families from across the county, ensuring that children who might otherwise have received only the most basic education could access the kind of learning that would help them thrive in an increasingly modern world, a world quite different from the one her mother had first encountered as a young bride arriving from Ohio decades earlier. William Yates, applying the scientific ranching methods he had learned during his college studies, eventually took over primary management of the family ranch as his father Marshall grew older, expanding the operation significantly and introducing new breeding techniques that made Yates cattle particularly sought after throughout the region, ensuring the continued prosperity of the family legacy that had been built from such humble and tragic beginnings. Sarah Yates married her doctor suitor in 1905, and together they expanded medical services throughout the county, with Sarah's own nursing skills complementing her husband's medical training to provide care that had simply not been available to earlier generations of frontier families. Families like her own mother had once been, forced to manage illness and injury with only the most basic of home remedies and the occasional distant assistance of an overworked frontier doctor. As the story of Pauline Hurst and Marshall Yates passed into local legend, it became, for the community of Hurstville, a kind of foundational myth, a story told to young couples facing their own hardships as a reminder that love could grow from even the most unlikely and sorrowful of beginnings, that grief and joy were not opposites but often intimately connected, each capable of opening doors to the other in ways that defied easy explanation, but that anyone who had truly lived through hardship on the frontier could readily understand. The gravestone that eventually marked Elias Hurst's final resting place moved in later years to the town's proper cemetery when the original homestead location proved impractical for a permanent burial site, bore a simple inscription that Pauline herself had composed in her later years. Beloved husband and father, whose memory blessed the family he left behind, and whose loss, though grievous, opened a door to love's continuance. It was an inscription that spoke to the complex, often contradictory nature of grief and love, honoring the man who had first captured Pauline's heart while acknowledging, with unusual honesty for a gravestone, the way his death had ultimately led to new life and new love for the family he had left behind. Marshall's own gravestone, placed beside Pauline's when she joined him in death 3 years after his own passing, bore words that Pauline had chosen with equal care. He buried a stranger and found a family. He came seeking nothing and gave everything. Beloved husband, father, and grandfather, whose love redeemed sorrow and built abundant life from tragedy's ashes. The two gravestones stood together in the Hurstville Cemetery for generations afterward, a physical testament to a love story that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances, but had grown, through decades of shared commitment and mutual devotion, into something that continued to inspire and comfort those who heard the tale, reminding each new generation that even the darkest days of grief and loss could, with time and courage and an open heart, give way to unexpected joy and enduring love. In the family Bible that had been passed down through generations of Yates' descendants, alongside records of births and deaths and marriages that stretched back to that fateful October day in 1878, there remained, in Pauline's own careful handwriting, a brief account of how she had first met the man who would become her second husband, an account that ended with words that captured, better than any other testimony, the essential truth of their remarkable love story. He came to bury my grief and stayed to build my joy. In losing everything, I found, through his kindness and steady love, more than I ever dared to hope for again in this life. Let any who read this account, in whatever generation they may find themselves, take comfort in knowing that love can grow in the most unexpected soil, and that grief, however terrible, is not always the end of the story, but sometimes, if we are fortunate and brave enough to remain open to it, merely the difficult beginning of a far greater happiness than we could ever have imagined for ourselves. And so the story of Pauline Hurst and Marshall Yates, the widow and the man who had buried her first husband, passed into the enduring legend of the Montana frontier, a testament to love's remarkable capacity for growth even in the harshest of soils, a reminder across generations that the human heart, wounded though it may be by tragedy and loss, retains always the capacity for healing, for growth, and for a love that can transform even the deepest sorrow into the foundation of a life well and fully lived, surrounded by family, by abundance, and by a happiness that neither Pauline nor Marshall could have imagined possible on that terrible, transformative October day when a lonely writer first knelt beside a quiet creek to bury a stranger, never knowing that the act of simple human decency would become the first step on a journey toward the greatest love and happiness either of them would ever know.